Welcome to the third lecture on culture and conflict resolution. Cultures are like icebergs. There are certain things which are visible or primarily in awareness with respect to the influence of culture, while there are an even greater number which lie below the surface. People's worldviews and conceptions of other and self may not be visible, and it is the task of conflict resolution practitioner to dig deeper. Cultural contestation may have deep roots and undercurrents. Conflicts, and in particular intractable and protracted conflicts, are not only about the struggle for resources and material interests, but also for acknowledgement, recognition, and status. People's claims are cultural claims that only make sense to people in the local context. Understanding the motivations and the worldviews or the cultural side of the participants becomes a tool for analysis that can be productive in terms of taking action. We will focus on a particular form of discourse, narrative, which is not a fictional account, but an account that has emotional truth to the people telling it, and is about events that happened in the past, events that are happening in the present, and about these people's relationships to each other. Narratives have action components. They say what you might consider doing and what you shouldn't consider doing. There are windows to the cultural contestation. For example, when the Americans defined Saddam Hussein in both Gulf Wars as Hitler, it was very clear that you don't talk to a Hitler. After such discursive framing, Saddam became a person that we cannot talk or reason with, and the only way to deal with him was violent action. Discourses and narratives are abstract constructs that allow the science to assign and communicate specific, repeatable relations to, between, and among objects, subjects, and a statement. They are medium through which power relations are produced. Conflict resolution involves separating from the conflict story. Conflict emerges when people are generalizing. We need to move away from essentialist thinking, such as men are from Mars, women are from Venus. You are arrogant, she is stubborn, he is an aggressive person, she is always difficult to deal with. Discursive approaches avoid explaining conflict through a person's nature, personality, core self, underlying interests and needs. As Michael White suggests, the person is not the problem is the problem. The alternative is to understand conflict as always produced out of discourse. In conflicts, discourse can be expected to shape what can be said, who can say it, subjective positions, underlying interests and needs, expectations. Those whose discourse story is marginalized lose ground. They are outside the moral order. They become objects. So the struggle over discourses is a power struggle. Discourses are used to justify and institutionalize violence. Violence thus becomes part of everyday practice. Conflict discourses are simplified. Dualism of us versus them. Peace discourses are, on the other hand, complex, and they provide alternative, multifaceted story. Moving away from dichotomies that create conflict, such as they are bad and we are good, that is what conflict resolution is about. Life is more complex than any one story. There are always gaps, contradictions, exceptions, and alternative storylines. In the shadow of a conflict story, there exist other stories of relationship that are being subordinated. Some stories are dominant stories, and some stories are subordinate stories. Double listening is about identifying cultural nuances in the story, body language, and facial expressions. There is always a conflict story and a counter story of a different relationship. Conflict resolution is about accessing a different, better story. Double listening is a technique for identifying alternative hidden story. The words such as but indicate existence of two stories. It is a task of CR practitioner to look into both stories and uncover related nuances. High context and low context communication refers to the degree to which speakers rely on factors other than explicit speech to convey their messages. This concept was developed by Edward T. Hall. All of us engage in both high context and low context communication. There are times we say what we mean and mean what we say, leaving little to be read in to the explicit message. This is low context communication. At other times, we may infer, imply, insinuate, or deliver nonverbal cues, messages that we want to have conveyed but do not speak. This is high context communication. Jimmy Carter understood the importance of high context communication with his counterparts from Israel and Egypt in the historic Camp David peace negotiations. Carter reports that Prime Minister Benin was about to leave the negotiations after several days, discouraged at having reached an impasse. Carter presented him with pictures of the three heads of state inscribed with the names of each of Benin's grandchildren. Prime Minister Benin repeated the names of his grandchildren out loud as he paused to look at the pictures, seeming to reflect on the importance of the peace negotiations to the grandchildren's future. Carter knew instinctively that no direct low-context appeal would work to bring Prime Minister Benin back to the negotiating table. Instead, Carter relied on a high-context reference to legacy, future generations, and the relations that Begin cared about. He invoked the communities each leader served by reminding Benin of his grandchildren. Through Carter's masterful high-context appeal, negotiations resumed and peace was achieved between neighbors. Although temporary, thanks for listening.